When we think about subtle energies, our minds are so conditioned to dealing with physical energies and physical ways of measuring them that we tend to think the same thing about subtle energies. But it's probably not that simple. It may be that, at least at the present stage of our knowledge, the only way to begin to detect or measure certain kinds of subtle energies is by having sensitive human beings. So how do we make sensitive human beings? This is a particularly tricky question, because while I think we're much more sensitive than we give ourselves credit for, a lot of times this sensitivity has been suppressed by cultural and personal conditioning, and or it's been overlaid by imagination about these things, again as a result of our own personal and cultural conditioning. So what I want to talk about here is, how do you train people to become more sensitive? I thought about this because I was recently reading the end of the quarter papers of the students in my class at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology on mindfulness. And these students have spent a quarter with me being trained in basic mindfulness techniques, drawn from a variety of the world's spiritual traditions, but modified by my own psychological knowledge into forms that I think are reasonably sensible. I never knew I was going to get involved in that sort of thing, much less teaching it as part of my professional role. I can remember years ago trying to find grant money to do research on training extrasensory perception abilities, and I was approaching the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and one of their trustees was interested in funding me, but not to do that research, but to write a book about Gurdjieff, who had claimed to be able to teach people mindfulness in everyday life. Well, this wasn't quite what I wanted, but as I thought about it, it was going to be kind of interesting because I'd done a lot of Gurdjieff work. So I ended up with my first book on mindfulness called Waking Up, Overcoming the Obstacles to Human Potential. And that book is still available in print and is a relatively formal psychological sort of presentation of how the ordinary mind works and how you can train it to be more mindful. I got enthusiastic about teaching mindfulness after that and ended up writing a couple of other books, a second one called Living the Mindful Life, and a third one called Mind to Science. The third one's particularly interesting because it came as a result of workshops I gave at the Tour de Psychology of Consciousness conference at Tucson. And these were primarily to scientists interested in consciousness, but tremendously intellectual. A kind of person like me, who I think is has great difficulty becoming mindful because they're so used to thinking all the time about everything. And those workshops were successful, so I figured if I can give people a taste of mindfulness when they're so intellectual to begin with, I must have been doing something right. Anyway, I've ended up teaching a mindfulness class at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology each quarter. And again, I thought of this as a challenge. Transpersonal psychology, which is the fancy academic term for what I'd rather call spiritual psychology, except that every religion thinks it has a lock on spirituality. But anyway, the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology is a unique graduate school where we try to take a scholarly and scientific as well as an experiential approach to the world's various spiritual traditions and begin to find out what works for people, what doesn't work for people, and how can we actually train people at an experiential level, not just a verbal level like ordinary graduate school does. For example, when I arranged for a black belt instructor in Aikido to begin teaching classes for a student club at Davis years ago, of which I was the student advisor, I quickly found that in about 3 weeks I could explain the martial art of Aikido much better than my black belt instructor. He'd hardly finished high school. I could relate it to philosophy and physics and psychology, except I kept noticing I couldn't actually do anything, and he could kind of toss me across the room with a wave of his little finger. Really brought the importance of different kinds of awareness home to me, that words were nice but certainly not sufficient and often misleading. So, as part of teaching people mindfulness and hopefully making them more aware of subtle energy, I teach this course usually in the fall quarter of each year. And I begin by teaching them a kind of classical concentrative meditation. The basic idea in all spiritual traditions being that our ordinary minds are darting about so much, so fickle and unstable, that you certainly can't learn much about the mind or your body or reality because you're not looking steadily long enough at anything. Once they have a little taste for that, and it can only be a little taste because this is a one-quarter course, I introduce them to insight meditation, or vipassana as it's called in Buddhism, where now that you have a little bit of concentration available, you turn that concentration on to examining the way your own mind works, to see at first just your body sensations, which is a very nice way to begin to tune into possible subtle energy flows, and eventually trying to broaden this clearer insight to be able to observe your emotions, your thoughts, and your body sensations and your perceptions, all with greater clarity and equanimity, and becoming more realistically in touch with the world around you. And as a side effect, even though you're kind of focused on the world, I'm jumping ahead of myself slightly, but even though you're focused mainly on the world in the main technique I teach them from Gurdjieff, you begin to gather insights about yourself. So having given the students a basis like this, I introduce them to Gurdjieff's technique of self-remembering, which in a simplified way means you first believe in your own curiosity about what's really going on in myself and the world, instead of what I think should be going on, or what I'm emotionally attached to and all that. How can I get a clearer understanding of myself and the world? And then you learn this basic technique of self-remembering, in which, while taking in the outside world, the stimuli coming in, you are simultaneously paying attention to your own inner reactions to this. P.D. Ouspensky, one of Gurdjieff's main disciples, drew a double-headed arrow and said that normally all our attention is directed outward, but if we direct it both inward and outward, so we're aware of what we're doing, we become more awake, we become more able to be in touch with reality. The result of this is that the students all get a taste of what it's like to actually be more present, more open, more calm and equanimous about what's actually going on. And a lot of times they then talk about sensing aspects of situations, which is very valuable in and of itself. They just feel more sensitive, and which I think is the foundation for beginning to use human beings as detectors of subtle energy. You have to have a good, clear understanding of what your own internal processes are, how you push and pull and distort or enhance various kinds of sensations, the noise level, as it were, from your own internal stories. And when you begin to get a good idea of that, then you can begin to get a clearer idea of what you're actually detecting as you walk into various situations, as people do various things. I've been kind of general because that's all that time allows me on this, but I think this development of more sensitive, less biased people is going to be a major step in trying to learn more about what subtle energies are and aren't, what we think about them versus what they actually are, how we may begin to apply them in useful sorts of ways. So, if you want to get a start on that, you can look at the books I've mentioned, or try to be aware both of what you're perceiving now and your internal reactions to it. Ground yourself in your body and see what happens.